The prevailing narrative surrounding Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward has often portrayed him as a genocidal leader responsible for immense suffering and economic disaster. However, a closer examination of the facts reveals a more nuanced and complex picture of the era. While acknowledging the challenges and setbacks of the Great Leap Forward, it is essential to recognize the achievements and positive aspects that emerged from Mao's policies. Contrary to the notion that the Mao era was characterized solely by famine and hardship, reputable demographers such as Judith Bannister have highlighted the significant successes of the period. Bannister acknowledges that during 1973 to 1975, life expectancy in China surpassed that of many regions around the world, including Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and numerous Latin American countries. Furthermore, in 1981, she co-authored an article describing the People's Republic of China as a superachiever in terms of mortality reduction, with life expectancy increasing by approximately 1.5 years per calendar year since the establishment of the communist rule in 1949. This progress resulted in a substantial rise in life expectancy from 35 in 1949 to 65 in the 1970s, when Mao's rule came to an end. Critics often argue that living standards did not improve in China until Deng Xiaoping assumed power, undermining the notion of progress during the Mao era. However, it is irrational to assert that life expectancy increased significantly without a corresponding improvement in living standards, contradict the evidence presented by Mao Zedong. Claims that per capita grain production remained stagnant during Mao's reign contradict the evidence presented by Mao Zedong, a former director of policy and law in the Chinese Ministry of Agriculture during the post-Mao era. Guo reports that between 1949 and 1978, the per hectare yield of land sown with food crops increased by 145.9%, and total food production rose by 169.6%. Moreover, China's population grew by 77.7% during this period, resulting in a per capita food production increase from 204 kilograms to 328 kilograms. These figures challenge the notion of a stagnant agricultural sector and suggest that Mao's policies yielded positive outcomes in terms of food production. Industrial development during the Mao era also defies the prevailing narrative of economic disaster. Official figures released by the Deng Xiaoping regime indicate an annual increase of 11.2% in industrial production from 1952 to 1976, with a 10% yearly growth rate, even during the alleged catastrophe of the Cultural Revolution. By 1975, industry accounted for 72% of the gross value of national output in China, while agriculture constituted 28%. These statistics reveal that Mao's socialist economic policies laid the foundation for rapid economic development in the post-Mao era, albeit with certain inequalities and imbalances. The Great Leap Forward, often vilified as a period of chaos and inefficiency, played a crucial role in China's economic growth. As tensions between China and the Soviet Union escalated in the late 1950s, Mao sought to develop a more independent economic policy. The split between the two nations was driven by ideological differences. China's alternative approach involved simultaneous agricultural and industrial development, utilizing abundant labor and popular enthusiasm in the absence of significant capital and advanced technology. Although the Great Leap Forward encountered challenges and initial disruptions, it significantly contributed to the ongoing growth of agriculture. Measures such as water conservancy and irrigation led to sustained increases in agricultural production, once the period of poor harvest subsided. These measures also address the issues of drought and flood defense. Simultaneously, Rural industry, including the notorious backyard steel furnaces, supported the modernization of agricultural practices and provided the necessary tools, equipment, and fertilizer to enhance agricultural productivity. This decentralized approach, focusing on local needs and labor-intensive methods, bypassed the need for costly nationwide infrastructure and transportation networks. Contrary to claims of economic illiteracy, the Great Leap Forward fostered a change in the mindset and consciousness of the Chinese people, going beyond mere industrial production figures. Mao's emphasis on leaps aimed to revolutionize people's understanding and participation in the country's development. Although there were undoubtedly mistakes and disappointing results, the subsequent success of the Chinese economy demonstrates that valuable lessons were learned from this period. The debate surrounding the Great Leap Forward and the qualitative evidence supporting the narrative of a massive death toll continues to be contentious. While the mainstream Western view portrays the Great Leap Forward as a catastrophic disaster, it is important to critically examine the basis for this perspective. Proponents of a massive death toll should provide credible qualitative evidence, such as eyewitness testimonies or documentary evidence, to substantiate their claims. However, the existing qualitative evidence is not entirely convincing. Carl Riskin, a Chinese history scholar, acknowledges that a serious famine did occur during the Great Leap Forward, but questions the extent of the qualitative evidence supporting the notion of a mass famine. He highlights that much of the contemporary evidence from the time, particularly those originating from right-wing sources, was discounted and lacked conclusiveness. Riskin also suggests that the repressive policies implemented by the Chinese government might have hindered the dissemination of information about the famine, but he remains uncertain if this is a sufficient explanation. The scarcity of persuasive qualitative evidence leaves a degree of mystery surrounding the actual extent of the famine. Authors like Roderick MacFarquhar, Jasper Becker, and Chang assert that the evidence they have encountered substantiates the claims of a mass famine. Although they cite sources in their works, they do not provide sufficient clarity on why these sources should be considered authentic. This raises questions about the unquestioned acceptance of their accounts in the West. In contrast, Felix Green, who traveled through China in 1960, observed tight food rationing but did not witness mass starvation. He also cites other eyewitnesses who report similar observations. While famine might have occurred in certain areas, Green's account suggests that the scale of hunger was not as apocalyptic as suggested by authors like Becker. This begs the question of why accounts like Green's are discounted while those of Becker and others are readily believed. It is worth noting that Green's sympathies for Mao's regime may raise doubts about his objectivity, but it is equally important to consider the perspectives of authors like Becker, MacFarquhar, and Chang, who could be considered staunch anti-communists. When examining the authentication of sources, it is crucial to consider the broader context of the discussion surrounding communism. Communism has historically faced intense opposition, with Western countries engaging in a propaganda war against it. Communist governments implemented policies that led to the displacement of the landlord and business classes, generating bitterness among those affected. Consequently, a significant number of well-educated individuals from these countries have had and continue to have motivations to discredit communism. In light of this, it is not unwarranted to request that authors who write about the communist era ensure that their sources provide unbiased and factual testimony, free from distortion or slant influenced by anti-communist bias. Additionally, it is well documented that the US government had an interest in disseminating negative propaganda about Chinese communism and communism in general. While discussions on these covert attempts to discredit communism are often dismissed as conspiracies, the evidence regarding these efforts is not widely discussed. Covert actions by US intelligence agencies to influence publications critical of communist regimes are part of the historical record. It is important to acknowledge that the individuals who received funding from the US government were not mere hacks paid for sensationalism, but were respected intellectuals. For example, the China Quarterly, where many articles on living conditions in China and the success or failure of government policies were published, received funding that emanated from the CIA. Roderick McFarker, the editor of the China Quarterly, acknowledges that the Congress of Cultural Freedom, which funded the publication, was backed by a wide range of foundations, including the Fairfield Foundation, which is a CIA front. In recent years, a new generation of writers has emerged presenting alleged eyewitness and documentary evidence to support the narrative of a massive death toll. For example, Frank DeCotta, in his book Mao's Great Famine, claims to have accessed previously undisclosed archival material that provides evidence of a death toll in the tens of millions. However, the authenticity and reliability of these sources has also been called into question. Some scholars argue that the quantitative evidence, such as demographic data and population estimates, does not align with the claims of a massive death toll. They point out that official Chinese population statistics show a steady increase during the Great Leap Forward period, which seems contradictory to the notion of millions of deaths. Critics argue that if such a massive death toll had occurred, it would have left a more discernible impact on the overall population figures. Furthermore, subsequent research and analysis have raised doubts about the methodology used to estimate the death toll during the Great Leap Forward. Some scholars argue that the methods employed, such as comparing population growth rates, have inherent flaws and are not reliable indicators of famine deaths. They suggest that more comprehensive studies incorporating a variety of data sources and rigorous statistical analysis are needed to arrive at a more accurate assessment of the death toll. It is essential to approach the topic with a critical and balanced perspective, acknowledging the limitations and biases in the available evidence. The debate surrounding the Great Leap Forward's death toll is complex and politically charged, influenced by ideological, historical, and geopolitical factors. Consequently, reaching a definitive conclusion is challenging. Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader who came to power after Mao's death, launched a campaign to vilify Mao's legacy and specifically target the Great Leap Forward. This campaign began in 1979 and was part of Deng's broader agenda to roll back the socialist policies implemented during Mao's era and introduce capitalist reforms. To legitimize his political takeover and promote his own pragmatic approach to history and ideology, Deng needed a justification for distancing himself from Mao's policies. He portrayed Mao as being 70% right and 30% wrong, effectively suggesting that Mao's approach was flawed and that he had the solutions to correct the mistakes. Deng's subsequent implementation of pro-market policies indicated his belief that Mao's policies were even more erroneous, estimating Mao's correctness to only be about 20%. The Chinese Communist Party actively promoted the narrative that the Great Leap Forward was a catastrophic failure caused by ultra-leftist policies. High-ranking officials, such as Marshal Jianying, delivered speeches attributing disasters to the leftist errors of that period. In 1981, the party's Resolution on Party History acknowledged serious losses to our country and people between 1959 and 1961, further solidifying the narrative of the Great Leap Forward as a calamity. Academics were also involved in the attack on the Great Leap Forward. Professor Lu Zhang, director of the Institute of Population Research, presented death rate figures at a public academic gathering in 1981. These figures suggested that there were 16.5 million excess deaths between 1958 and 1961. The prominence given to these figures in the West, along with statements from economists like Sun Yafeng, served to reinforce the notion that the Great Leap Forward had resulted in a significant loss of life. Deng's campaign against the Great Leap Forward was not solely motivated by internal party struggles. It also aimed to dismantle Mao's positive achievements and introduce capitalist reforms. Deng dissolved the agricultural communes in the early 1980s, which had previously provided welfare services such as free healthcare and education to peasants. The dismantling of the communes meant an end to these services, leading to real hardships for the rural population. While some commentators argue that Deng's agricultural reforms improved the welfare of the peasantry, the long-term impact of breaking up the communes resulted in a decline in per capita food production. Despite this decline, the breakup of the communes is often hailed as an economic success by Western commentators, overlooking the hardships faced by the peasants as a consequence. By labeling the Great Leap Forward as a disastrous period resulting in the deaths of millions, Deng was able to create a political narrative that justified his regressive policies in the countryside. This ideological strategy helped to portray his reforms as a necessary correction to Mao's policies, even though the consequences for the rural population were far from positive. For Deng Xiaoping's narrative to gain traction, he not only had to establish the occurrence of mass deaths during the years 1959 to 1961, but also attribute them primarily to policy errors. Prior to Deng's regime, the official Chinese government's stance on the famine was that 70% of the blame lay with natural disasters and 30% with human error. However, Deng's administration reversed this verdict in the 1980s, claiming that the problems were 30% due to natural disasters and 70% due to human error. If Mao's actions had truly resulted in the deaths of millions of peasants, one would expect the affected population to hold Mao accountable. However, the evidence suggests that the peasants did not primarily blame Mao for the problems they endured during the Great Leap Forward. Professor Han Dongping conducted research in Chang and Henan, the regions where the most severe famine conditions occurred between 1959 and 1961. Han Dongping found that most of the farmers he interviewed favored the interpretation that attributed less blame to Mao, indicating that they did not view Mao as primarily responsible for the problems they faced. This is not to deny the occurrence of tragic errors. Dongping noted the introduction of communal eating in rural communes, which was initially popular among the peasants. In fact, many farmers reported experiencing unprecedented abundance in 1958. However, this newfound abundance led to carelessness in food harvesting and consumption. People began to assume that the government would guarantee food supplies, absolving themselves of personal responsibility for food security. Given China's poverty in the late 1950s, this era was bound to lead to serious problems, and the communist leadership should have taken swift action to rectify the situation. 3 years of devastating natural disasters exacerbated the crisis. Solidarity among commune members in the hardest hit regions broke down as individuals sought to seize crops before harvest, further worsening the situation. However, it is important to emphasize that the farmers themselves did not attribute the main cause of the famine to errors in the organization of communal eating. Han Dongping, although severely critical of Mao for the consequences of his hasty policies, found in his interviews that the farmers did not express negative views about Mao. Similarly, a scholar in Anhui, where the famine is alleged to have been more severe, reported not encountering any farmers who regarded Mao negatively or praised Deng Xiaoping. One may argue that Han Dongping's partial sympathy for Mao could have influenced his interpretation of the peasants' views. However, it is worth noting that 2 of Han Dongping's grandparents died from hunger-related diseases during the Great Leap Forward, and he often appears more critical of Mao's policies during that period than the peasants he interviewed.